Hello everybody, and welcome to this video in which I am going to address a fairly sensitive subject. I feel like I do need to do so though, because this is a topic that keeps coming up in the games industry, and it is largely with regards to the kinds of games that I like to play. It is the niche JRPGs, the visual novels, and the fan servicey stuff that tends to fall right into the middle of this discussion. And I am of course talking about censorship. Censorship is a very sensitive subject for a lot of people, and I have been hesitant to do anything about it for quite a while. I used to write the occasional opinion piece about it, but I feel like the discussion has lost nuance with this particular topic, and people don't really listen, don't really have a conversation about it. They have their minds made up, and if you are in alignment with their minds, their opinions, then that's great, they're on your side. But if you posit a different angle or you have a different opinion, then you tend to get slammed by these people because there is no middle ground, there's no room for conversation, there's no room for nuance. However, I do feel like I need to get my opinion down so that every time this blows up I can simply link to this video. So I'm hoping this is fairly comprehensive. It is going to be looking at one particular game which kind of kick-started this latest round of discussions, but it won't by any means be exclusive to that, because the conversations are pretty much the same every time this becomes an issue. Now, I want to make clear upfront and early that while I have issues with the way that people talk about censorship, I'm by no means defending the games that I'm going to be talking about. There's certainly criticisms I feel like you can make about localization, whether it is or isn't censorship, and those criticisms are certainly not invalid. I think that there is definitely a big line between the quality of a good localization and a bad localization, whether it amounts to censorship or not. So I want to make it very clear, and you do need to be very clear, because otherwise people think that you're defending this stuff. I'm not necessarily defending these games. I like some of them that other people don't. I don't like some translations that other people do, and that's fine. That's just personal preference and all that kind of stuff. So just making it clear here, this is purely a discussion about whether the thing that we're talking about should be classified as censorship. And it's an important distinction to make, because censorship has a certain set of associations and meanings that I feel like don't belong in this kind of conversation, and people confuse the issue by using the wrong word. What they're really complaining about is the quality of the localization or the direction of the localization, which is one thing. But to suggest it's censorship is another matter entirely, and I don't feel like that's always appropriate with this discussion. Sometimes it is, but other times, no, I don't think so. So the bit of news that kick-started this recent wave of discussion about censorship is the news that the Nintendo Switch version of Tokyo Mirage Sessions, which was a Wii U JRPG, would be using the Western version of the game for all markets, and that includes Japan. And this is contentious for a lot of people because the Western version of the game was, in some places, a fairly heavily modified version from the Japanese original. The Japanese original had this level in particular, which people tend to single out as their example of the censorship in action, has this level in which it's based around gravure, which I've discussed in previous videos on this YouTube channel. But gravure is kind of swimsuit models which blend sexiness and cuteness together in a way that is quite unique to Japan. We don't really have an equivalent to gravure in the West, as I've discussed in the past. And what the developers decided to do was take that scene and turn it into a scene in which the characters and the level design would be based around fashion photography instead. So the characters would be dressed, and the photo shoot would be flirty, and so on and so forth. It'd be kind of a youthy vibe fashion shoot. And that, for a lot of people, is a very obvious example of a big change from one side to the other, and they have interpreted that as censorship. Now, I don't necessarily believe that is censorship, and again, I'm not defending the translation or the localization. You can criticize that, but in terms of it being censorship, I don't think it is. I think it is an example of the developers looking for a way to take something that is exclusive to Japan and make it relevant to the Western market, so that the intent of the game developer is preserved from one version to the next. Now you might say, how can they possibly be preserving the intention of the developer if they're changing things? The point is that, as I mentioned before, gravure is not pornographic, nor is it particularly erotic. It's sexy, it's playfully sexy, but it's also cute. It's very charming, it's very youthy, it's very... Because Japan doesn't have the same kind of Puritan edge that the West does. People can see girls in swimsuits and being kind of cute, flirty poses and things like that, and they can interpret that as not necessarily sexy in the way that we see when we see a swimsuits model. For example, Sports Illustrated cover models, when they do the swimsuit issue, that's something that we see as very sexy. They're wearing basically the same clothes that the girls wear in gravure model fashion shoots, but the intent is different, and the way that we interpret those things is very different. So the Japanese see gravure as flirty, cute, kawaii, and various other things with a little bit of sexy in there as well, for sure. The West sees swimsuits as sexy, 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 particularly when it's kind of used in that kind of fashion shoot style. So to actually just take that and move it across would be to lose the meaning that the Japanese creators had, because they never meant for it to be purely sexy as we see it. So what the developers have done, they've looked for a type of fashion photography in the West and a type of kind of fashion tradition, and they've tried to find one which roughly translates from Japanese to English or to the West, particularly the American market, and they arrived at that kind of flirty, kind of youthful fashion vibe. And again, for the third time, I do need to be very careful with this disclaimer, because I know otherwise people are going to misinterpret me. I'm not saying that that is the right localization angle to take, but I believe that is the intent behind it. It was not an intent. There was no intent in there to outright censor the game. There was no kind of malicious effort in there to change the ideology of the game by taking content out of it. And I believe that applies to most video games. I don't believe most video games, even those that are changed in such a way because of some kind of outside influence telling the developers that they're not allowed to do this, or that there's some kind of government agency actually threatening to ban the game or destroy copies of the game or arrest the people playing the game or whatever. Because remember, censorship has a very heavily loaded series of implications behind it, that anybody who is in defiance of that censorship is in for a world of pain. It is a much harsher way of blocking content than I think than applies to a lot of these games. A lot of the time I feel like the effort is simply to make the game appropriate, not in the sense of conforming to Puritan values, but appropriate in the sense that they want to convey the meaning of the Japanese original into the West, and that means you need to make changes. And the reason I think this is not necessarily to do with the video games itself, but it has to do with just the way that I've seen localization happen across all art forms. I've been to Shakespeare plays in Japan because I've been really interested in how they would take something so dense in terms of poetry and meaning and translate that into the Japanese language. And I can tell you what they certainly don't do is just take scenes wholesale, convert them into Japanese and then just repeat them. And they don't just take those scenes, convert them into Japanese and then reorder them so they're in the right sentence structure. This is not a Google Translate plus the work of an editor. They actually have to look at every single word, figure out what that word kind of means, and then figure out where they can find an equivalent in the other language in such a way that still maintains the structure, because remember, Shakespeare is very poetic, so you need to have that kind of poetic rhythm as well. It's definitely not easy, and it is certainly not a case of just taking words and taking them from one language to the next. Now, of course, when it comes to Shakespeare, nobody's changing entire scenes, and again, I'm not saying that the localizations in video games are necessarily done well or done correctly, but to suggest that localization is not about change at all, and is not about, not just changing words, but actually changing scenes or changing the entire structure at times, is to not really understand how translation, or how localization, I should say, works. And the same goes vice versa. I've done a lot of study of haiku poems, and haiku is an incredibly different difficult thing to translate into English, because haiku has a very specific set of syllables for each of the three lines in the haiku. And that means that every single word in those very short poems is absolutely loaded with meaning, and it is very difficult to take that and move it into another language. And there are books that I've really wanted to read in English, but are basically impossible to translate. They're impossible to localize because the use of language is so dense and so incredibly difficult that finding the meaning of the author and then putting it into a different language is actually impossible. So I feel like when it comes to talking about video games, there is this sense that if you're translating a game, if you're localizing a game, you cannot change any of it. It has to be exactly what was in the original, just in a different language. And that means that, yes, you need a certain level of skill to take the words and to put them into a different language and then rearrange them, because Japanese sentence structure and English sentence structure are different. So you need to be able to, move the words around. But there is this sense that it's somehow possible to just literally take one and then put it into another language. And that's not really how localization works, because localization is about more than just words. It's about meaning. And meaning is a very difficult thing because the Japanese and Western cultures are quite different. So they have different meanings all the way down to the individual word level at times. So I'll give you a really easy example of a word that you will hear a lot if you listen to Japanese voice tracks, because it is a word in very common use in Japan, and that's sugoi. Now, sugoi means a whole lot of things in Japanese. It means a combination of superb, wonderful, amazing, that's great, marvelous, fabulous. It means a whole combination of these kinds of really dramatic, positive words that combined, we don't have in English. There is no actual translation for sugoi. If you were to just pick out one of those words and say amazing, then you're not really translating the full weight of the meaning of sugoi. But if you were to translate it as wow, amazing, great, fabulous, and marvelous, you sound like a bit of an idiot because you're throwing together too many dramatic words. Whereas in Japan, it's just one, so you don't sound like an idiot. That's just one very, very simple, very small example of what a translator, a localizer has to deal with. If a Japanese artist uses the word sugoi in their work, you need to figure out how to make that meaning, all the weight of that meaning in that word, translate across into English. And that is really, really not easy. There are so many different ways to do it, and that's why so many different translators look at things in a different way. And that's why if you were to give one translator a work that included the word sugoi, you would have a different translation to if you were to give it to another one. And for the fourth time, I think, or fifth time, I'm not suggesting that every translation is good, and certainly there are ways to translate sugoi which I would do that perhaps another one would not, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe they're wrong, or maybe nobody's wrong, because localization is actually part of the artistic process in itself, and therefore doesn't necessarily, there is no right answer. But that's just one example. One tiny word, which was maybe one word in, if you look at Trails of Cold Steel, there's about 300 million words in that game. They have to translate every single one of those words, and not every single one of the words in that script has an English translation. Now, Trails of Cold Steel is an example of a game that is localized very well. At least the first two were. I haven't played the third yet, but the first two were. And I've lost my train of thought for a second there. That's an example of a game that is actually really well localized, and there are other games, Yakuza for example, which I think is consistently well localized. There are other games which are not anywhere near as well localized, and they might be grammatically correct, but I feel like they're not been as effective at carrying across the meaning from one game to the next. And of course the thing about video games is that they're not just text, they're not just a script, they're not just performance, they're also visual, they're also music. They've got all of these other elements in there that the localization team needs to deal with. And I do feel that in some instances, preserving the meaning, the visual sugoi, if you will, the graphical sugoi, the sound effects sugoi, taking some of those elements which are fairly unique to Japanese culture and moving them in such a way that they're still relevant in the West does necessitate some changes. Now, that is not censorship. Again, this is not censorship. This is localization. They're very different things, and I feel like in the conversation about all of this stuff in video games, we've lost sight of that. People see a change and immediately assume censorship, but censorship is very insidious, and censorship is something that is so nasty that to just accuse somebody of doing that because they've made a change in localization it's a little bit knee-jerky in as a reaction. Now, personally, I think that Tokyo Mirage Sessions, at least the Wii U version that I remember playing a fair while ago now, but I remember loving that game. I feel like the westernization, the localization of Tokyo Mirage Sessions was on point. I feel like it still had the right balance of fan service for what the developer was intending. It was never meant to be an erotic game. It was never meant to be raunchy. It was never meant to be overly sexy. So I feel like taking the gravure out and putting a kind of fun fashion shoot in there instead was the right move. Now, that's not to say I like every localization, and not even, localizations done by Nintendo themselves. A good example is Maiden of Blackwater, Fatal Frame, or Project Zero, depending on what region of the world you're in. Maiden of Blackwater was changed, was edited in localization from the Japanese to the West, and that was the costumes. There was this really skimpy, nearly see-through swimsuit that you could unlock for one of the characters, or a couple of the characters. I can't remember, I didn't play the Japanese version, but there was a swimsuit that you could unlock for those characters, and that swimsuit was very sexy. And that was removed for the Western version to instead put like Mario costumes in and stuff. And I felt like that was very poor translation and localization, because Fatal Frame, as an example of the horror genre, or Project Zero, depending again on which region of the world you're in, Fatal Frame Project Zero has always had that kind of sexual undertone to the action, because it's a horror game, and horror and sex have always been fairly closely linked, and that game certainly explored that. And on top of that, Maiden of Blackwater was all about the water rolling off the body, and the water interacting with the body, and it clinging to the body and dampening the body. And the swimsuit, even though it was an unlockable and it wasn't the default costume, the swimsuit actually made sense for that game, and to remove it was quite poor localization. Again, I wouldn't necessarily accuse it of censorship, but I certainly think that in that case Nintendo was concerned about sensitivities about sexuality in video games and didn't want to deal with that. So decided to change it to make it appropriate for the local culture, but in doing so actually lost some of the appeal of the game. Just as a final point, censorship absolutely does exist in the video game industry. You only need to look at the classification board in Australia and New Zealand to see that, where games with very mild elements in them get themselves banned completely simply because the classification board has some very arbitrary rules, particularly around drug use and sex. That means that stuff can get banned and removed from the market, and people can be prevented from actually being able to import this stuff. So that is definitely censorship, and if it's not clear enough from this video, I'm sorry. I absolutely hate censorship. I think censorship is an evil and needs to be actively fought against wherever it shows up. I just have a more nuanced view, I guess, of what actually constitutes censorship, and I do draw a line between localization and censorship. Localization can be good, bad, but either way, it's still not censorship. Now, there are things that developers can do to sidestep all of this, and you're seeing that a little bit with developers choosing to release games in English, but in the Asian market, so that people who are interested in this stuff can just import it without any changes. Customs doesn't bat an eye, especially when you can just download them and bypass customs entirely. Dead or Alive Extreme Volleyball, which you would have seen clips of while I've been talking, is a good example of that. That's a good way of bypassing any of this issue without having to change your content. You can basically keep it, and then just assume that the people who are going to import it will understand the cultural nuance, rather than having to change the content to suit the culture that the game's been sold in. So there are ways around it. I would certainly encourage more developers to go down that route, to be honest, because with consoles being region free these days, it's a very easy way of bypassing that kind of controversy. But other than that, I don't have too much to say. I hope this was interesting. I hope it at least gave you something, a different way of looking at this topic. It is something that I hope, assuming I don't get downvoted to hell, I will link back to every time this conversation comes up, because it will again and again and again. As long as people localize games, there will be some changes, and when changes happen, there will be some people that get upset by them. Sometimes those changes will be so big that that it becomes a controversy, a la Tokyo Mirage Sessions. But for now, that's my piece on the topic. Like I said, I hope it was interesting. Please don't hate me. I'm still on your side. I still love fan service. I still love sex games. I still love R18 stuff and all of that. So this is not an indication of my taste in games. It's just simply that I just see things, I think, a bit differently to people who just immediately assume censorship. Alright, thanks very much for watching this video. Please do back me on Patreon if you enjoyed my videos, and I will continue to do more. Otherwise, we will see you at the next video. This is a very long one now. Thanks very much for watching and your patience, and yes, see you next time.